Why would you be banished from ancient Greece before you even had breakfast? Because in ancient Greece, survival wasn't about strength. It wasn't about knowledge. It was about understanding the rules, the ones no one told you. And chances are, you're already failing. But we'll get to that. Before we drift too far into history, let me quietly remind you, if calm, slow, curious history is your kind of story, perhaps like this video, or leave a quiet thought in the comments, or subscribe softly if you'd like. Small things help this sleepy channel grow, gently. Now, back to ancient Greece. Let's imagine you wake up, not in your modern home, but in Athens. Not the Athens you see in films, all gleaming marble and heroic speeches, real Athens. Dusty streets, stone courtyards, rows of clay oil lamps that gutter in the early morning breeze. You've survived the night. Well done. That's the easy part. Now it's morning. And you're about to get yourself exiled, because ancient Athens doesn't work the way you think it does. You step outside, groggy. You stretch, yawn, perhaps look for something familiar. There's bread, there's wine, there's maybe an olive or two, and before you know it, someone's watching you. You've stood in the wrong place, spoken too soon, looked too long, broken a rule that isn't written down. And in this world, that matters, because in ancient Athens, social survival was a game of visibility. Everyone could see you, and being seen meant being judged. From the moment the sun rose over the marble temples, public life wasn't just active, it was mandatory. Every movement, every glance, every comment was a thread in a tapestry bigger than you. And if your thread didn't fit, they cut it. Exile wasn't a punishment for crime, it was a tool, a civic strategy. And here's where it gets fascinating. Once a year, in the middle of the public square, Athenians held a vote. But they weren't voting for leaders. They weren't choosing officials, they were choosing who to remove. Not by anger, not by accusation, simply for being inconvenient. If your name came up too many times, 10 years, gone. No debate, no trial, no appeal. And the reason? Because you disrupted balance. Maybe you were too ambitious. Maybe you challenged a priest too loudly. Maybe you, like many others, were simply popular enough to make people nervous. In ancient Greece, standing out wasn't celebrated, it was watched, and when necessary, it was ended. But what about you? You're not famous, you're just you. Unfortunately, that's enough, because public decorum in Athens wasn't about fame, it was about fitting the role expected of you. Walk where you're supposed to, speak when appropriate. Eat modestly. Avoid confrontation. Sounds easy. It's not. Let's talk about breakfast. In your world, breakfast is casual. You eat when you're hungry. Maybe you scroll through something while sipping tea. But in Athens, breakfast is ritual. Not in a religious sense, but in a social one. Athenian mornings began with simple, deliberate meals. Bread dipped in wine, a few olives, perhaps figs if they were in season. And this wasn't rushed, it wasn't optional. You ate as expected, quietly, modestly, in the right space. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was order. Disrupt breakfast, disrupt the day. And what do? You question the olives. You laugh too loudly. You step onto the wrong part of the stone pavement reserved for elders, not newcomers. And just like that, suspicion begins. Because in a society where visibility equals judgment, anything unusual is a problem. You are unusual, and therefore you are a problem. You might think that's dramatic, but consider this. Ancient Greeks believed that personal behavior reflected community health. An individual who ignored customs wasn't just strange, they were dangerous. It was called ataxia, disorder, a person whose actions suggested chaos, unpredictability. And in a democracy obsessed with stability, unpredictability gets removed. So, step by step, you drift closer to the unspoken line. Did you speak out of turn at the fountain? Did you question an elder about the weather? Did you interrupt a quiet morning with your questions? Congratulations, you've marked yourself. And perhaps it won't be today. Perhaps your mistakes will go unnoticed for a while. But as you sip your wine-dipped bread across the agora, someone will begin writing your name on a shard of pottery, a shard called an ostracon, because when the next vote arrives, when citizens gather to decide who disturbs their peace, they'll scratch your name into clay, and enough scratches, that's exile, not forever, just 10 years, a reasonable amount of time to rethink your choices. But don't imagine exile was harsh. You weren't imprisoned, you weren't punished, you were removed, silently, without anger, because you didn't fit, and in ancient Athens, fitting mattered. Why? Because survival wasn't about dominance, it was about harmony. The polis, the city, was a living thing, a balance of voices, rituals, and daily acts that maintained its identity. You weren't an individual, you were a note in the chorus. Sing wrong, and the chorus removes you. This is why breakfast was important, why walking in the right space mattered, why standing silently beside the morning fountain wasn't just acceptable, it was expected, because visible compliance was the fabric of peace, and when that fabric tore, they knew how to patch it, without cruelty, without debate, just silence, and a road leading outward. Now, as the sun rises higher and the clay roofs begin to warm, you might wonder, could you adapt? Perhaps. Could you learn the unspoken rules? Possibly. But history suggests otherwise, because most outsiders didn't adapt. They questioned, they hesitated, they disrupted. And ancient Greece didn't banish for crime, it banished for discomfort. And this morning, you've made people uncomfortable. So enjoy your olives. It may be your last breakfast here. Sleepy survival isn't guaranteed. Not when the city's watching. Not when silence is a sentence. Not when exile is as casual as a morning meal. Now, let's see if you survive until lunch. How did ancient Greece decide who should leave? Now that you've survived your first Athenian breakfast, barely, you're probably wondering something. Who decides who gets banished? You imagine it's complicated, perhaps a council, a debate, a long trial, where silver-tongued philosophers argue your fate while stroking their beards dramatically. It's not. It's much simpler. Because in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, exile was democratic. That's the surprising part. Ostracism, a word you know, but not like this. In Athens, exile wasn't a punishment handed down by rulers. It was a civic decision, a vote, not a legal sentence for crimes, but a public verdict on inconvenience. And if you disturbed the peace, in ways large or small, the people themselves could remove you for 10 years, without anger, without argument, just removal. Let's explain. Once a year, every citizen of Athens gathered in the agora, the public square, the city's beating heart. But this wasn't a festival, this wasn't a celebration, it was a ritual. In your modern world, voting usually means choosing someone, a leader, a law, a direction. In Athens, voting could mean the opposite, choosing someone to leave. This process, ostracism, derived from the word ostracon, a shard of pottery, because in a world without paper ballots, the Athenians used broken pottery to cast their votes. Each citizen would take an ostracon, a fragment of clay, and on it, they'd scratch a name, not just any name, the name of the person they felt the city would be better without. It could be a rival, a political figure, a popular general, or perhaps a stranger, a person who disrupted the rhythm of public life. Someone who questioned too many things, spoke too loudly, failed to respect ritual. Someone like you. But why? Why such a harsh mechanism? Why exile? Because the Athenians believed something that might seem strange to you. Success was dangerous. In Athens, to rise too high, too quickly, was to invite suspicion. Power concentrated, dangerous, ambition visible, threatening, even popularity, risky. And so, once a year, the citizens of Athens were asked a simple question: is there anyone whose continued presence here threatens the harmony of the city? If enough citizens said yes, through their votes, scratched into shards of clay, exile would follow. No trial, no appeal, just 10 years, elsewhere. But let's step back for a moment. The process of ostracism wasn't taken lightly. It wasn't every year that someone was actually exiled. First, the question had to be asked: shall we hold a vote for ostracism this year? If the answer was yes, the city prepared. Pottery shards were collected. Public scribes, for those who couldn't write, stood ready. And on the chosen day the people came. Thousands of Athenians filing through the agora, each carrying a simple shard, each thinking a simple thought: who do I fear? Not who do I hate, not who has wronged me. Who do I fear might disrupt this fragile balance we call Athens? Then names were scratched, dropped into urns, counted, and when the tally was done, if a threshold was reached, exile followed. The person whose name appeared most often was summoned. No debate, no defense, just exile, for 10 years. Now what did exile mean? You weren't arrested, you weren't harmed, you weren't even disgraced. In fact, it was seen as a relatively honorable form of civic protection. You were expected to go quietly, and many did. Why? Because ostracism wasn't shame, it was prevention. The city decided, your presence is a threat to balance, so we remove you. For a while, after 10 years you could return. No questions asked, no grudges held. Because in Athens, exile wasn't personal, it was procedural. But why does this matter to you? Because in your first morning in Athens, you've already made yourself visible, too visible, and visibility invites memory, which in turn invites votes. Now you might argue, I'm not a politician, I'm not popular, why would anyone vote against me? But in Athens, exile wasn't just for politicians. Sometimes it was used against social agitators, people whose presence unsettled the public, people whose behavior didn't fit, people who perhaps questioned the olives at breakfast, who laughed at the wrong moment, who walked in spaces meant for others. And you're all of those. Each tiny misstep, each breach of social expectation leaves a mark. And when the city votes, it remembers. But what's most interesting about ostracism is its tone. It wasn't violent, it wasn't dramatic, it was silent, orderly, calm, a city protecting itself from instability. You didn't need to be a criminal to be exiled. You only needed to be inconvenient, to disturb the harmony of the morning meal, to interrupt the flow of conversation at the fountain, to challenge rituals without understanding them, and perhaps most importantly, to stand out when you should have blended in. Athens valued conformity, not as oppression, but as survival. And your survival's problem. Now let's consider what exile looked like. You wouldn't be escorted out by guards. You'd simply be expected to leave. Friends might bid you farewell. Your possessions remained untouched. Your home, still yours, but your presence, prohibited. You could go wherever you liked, so long as it wasn't Athens. For 10 years, enough time to reflect, enough time to fade from memory. And when you returned, no one would speak of it, because exile wasn't a punishment. It was a pause, a civic breath. And when the city inhaled again, you'd be forgotten. So why would you be exiled before breakfast? Not for a crime, not for a sin, but for failing to understand the rules no one explained, for eating wrong, standing wrong, speaking wrong, existing wrong. And in a city obsessed with visible balance, wrongness is reason enough. Now sip your wine, dip your bread, keep your voice low. Perhaps no one has noticed yet. But the potters are preparing, and their shards remember names. Better hope yours isn't among them. What mistakes would you make before lunch? By now, you've survived breakfast. Barely, you've dipped your bread, sipped your wine, watched olives roll across dusty stone. You've kept your head down, mostly, and still, you're being watched. The question is why, and the answer, because you're modern and ancient Greece doesn't approve. But let's not judge you too harshly. You're not alone in your mistakes. Most outsiders, even ones who weren't literally from the future, made the same errors before midday. What mistakes? Oh, let's begin. First, you're standing wrong. Yes, really. You probably walked confidently into the agora, the public square, thinking it was just a space. Wrong. The agora isn't casual. It's structured. Invisible lines crisscross its stone surface. Who stands where matters? Who steps where matters? You see that shaded portico over there, reserved. That low marble bench, reserved. Those dusty sunlit paths through the center, technically open, but not for you. Athenians had deeply ingrained spatial customs, where you walked told others who you were, and when you don't know the pattern, you're noticed. Every step you take in the wrong place is like raising your hand and saying, "Look at me, I don't belong," and they will. Second mistake, you're making eye contact. In Athens, glances were conversations. To meet someone's eyes wasn't just acknowledgement, it was a statement. It suggested equal standing, a readiness to speak, perhaps to debate, and as a newcomer, you aren't equal. To the wrong person, a glance could be taken as arrogance. To the right person, it could be taken as a challenge. Neither is good, but you say, surely someone will explain. No, because in ancient Greece, explanations weren't public duties. Custom was absorbed, not taught. Mistake 3, you're touching things. See those amphorae, those tall clay jars near the fountain, decorative, aren't they? You touched one, someone saw, and now you've just interfered with ritual space. Amphorae weren't props. They marked places, moments, meanings, moving them, touching them, even brushing against them when you shouldn't. Unacceptable. And now, someone's scratching your name on an ostracon shard in their mind. Fourth mistake, you're asking questions. In modern life, curiosity is a virtue. In Athens, curiosity could be dangerous. Asking why someone does something, why the bread is dipped twice, why the morning libation is poured in silence, isn't seen as interest. It's seen as disruption, because questions imply a challenge, a disturbance, and disturbance, as we know, invites removal. Fifth mistake, you're eating wrong. Again, remember when we said you survived breakfast? Well, you didn't. Because after the first simple meal, there are morning offerings, small ritual acts of food shared at shrines, doorways, and public spaces, and you didn't participate. Or worse, you tried, and you did it wrong. Perhaps you poured wine before bread, or ate from a public bowl before the offering was made. What did you break? Not a law, a ritual, and rituals in ancient Greece weren't optional. They maintained balance between people, between gods, between past and present. You've disrupted that. People noticed. Which brings us to your most subtle, most dangerous mistake of all. You've been remembered. In a world without photographs, writing, or social media, identity in Athens was visual, spatial, and oral. You were known by where you stood, what you wore, how you acted, and you failed to blend in. That's why someone remembers you now, not your name, not your story, your disruption. They'll mention it in passing. A stranger who stood near the sacred fountain, a figure who stepped into the portico when they shouldn't have. Small stories ripple, and over time, names get scratched into shards. So what mistakes have you made before lunch? Almost all of them. You've stood wrongly, looked wrongly, eaten wrongly, spoken wrongly, existed wrongly, and in a city obsessed with visible harmony, that's reason enough to be removed. But you're tired now. The sun is rising higher, shadows shortening, people have drifted to their places. Perhaps you should find yours, assuming you still have one. How did Athenians react to exile? So you've made it through breakfast, stumbled your way through a morning of missteps, and discovered, perhaps the hard way, that your modern habits would have placed you firmly in the category of inconvenient. By now, the pottery shards have been quietly etched with your name, the votes have been counted, and your fate sealed. You're banished. But before we escort you gently to the city gates, let's pause a moment and consider something deeply important. How did the Athenians themselves react to exile? Were they outraged? Did they protest in anger, riot in the streets, demand justice? Not exactly. See, Athenians saw exile, especially the unique practice known as ostracism, as less punishment and more civic hygiene. It wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about vengeance. It was simply about protecting the balance of the city. Exile, to an Athenian, was strangely peaceful, quiet, ordered. No crying, no shouting, no pleading, just silent acceptance. When your name was called, you'd leave quietly. No argument, no explanation. You didn't plead your case because the city wasn't accusing you of a crime, it was making a quiet statement. Your continued presence, they believed, would disturb a carefully cultivated balance of harmony and peace. And that balance was everything. So let's follow you quietly through this unique Athenian moment. You're not alone. After all, many well-known Athenians experienced this fate. Themistocles, the famous general who saved Greece from Persian invasion, was voted into exile. Cimon, the great military hero and statesman, experienced it too. Even Aristisdes, known, ironically, as Aristisdes the Just, found himself quietly escorted from the city he loved. Imagine their thoughts as they left the familiar paths, walked away from marble columns and morning conversations in shaded porticos. Were they bitter? Possibly. Confused? Likely. But they understood one thing clearly: this exile wasn't personal. Athenians viewed their city as a delicate organism, and sometimes, to maintain health, the city had to remove a piece of itself temporarily. Athenians didn't exile in anger. They exiled thoughtfully, methodically, almost respectfully. To be exiled wasn't shameful, it was simply unfortunate. Like an illness requiring rest, exile allowed both the city and the exiled to heal from whatever tension had built between them. This idea is probably hard to grasp for someone like you. Modern life places personal freedoms above civic harmony. But in Athens, harmony was freedom. It was peace. Stability was the city's lifeblood, and exile was its quiet tool for maintaining it. So, your exile isn't a mark of hatred or punishment. It's simply maintenance. Civic maintenance. The people won't mock you as you go. In fact, friends and neighbors might quietly see you off at the city gates. They may provide food, water, perhaps some coin. They'll promise to remember you and await your return 10 years hence. There are no armed guards, no chains, no cells, just a quiet road leading outward. And as you walk that road away from Athens, perhaps you notice others in the distance, other figures, indistinct, who've shared your fate. You'll be remembered briefly, missed slightly, forgotten eventually. That's the quiet dignity of Athenian exile. No lasting stain, no permanent disgrace. Only absence. 10 years is a long time, but it's not forever. Athenian exile carried no lifelong shame. It was temporary. You'd return someday, quietly slipping back into the city as though you'd never left. But this was Athens, and Athenians loved symbolism. So when exiles returned, they entered the city gates at dawn, quietly, subtly, without fanfare or announcement. A quiet reintegration, symbolizing that balance had returned to normal. So, as you walk down that dusty road, imagine the strange serenity of the Athenian reaction. There's no drama, no resentment, only acceptance. The city would return to normal. You would return someday, and harmony, briefly disturbed by your presence, would settle back into its natural rhythm. Athenians understood that harmony wasn't easy. It took sacrifices, big and small. Your exile, however unfair it feels, was simply one of those small sacrifices. Quiet, dignified, purposeful. But here's the twist that might surprise you the most. Athenians genuinely believed that exile was good, not just for the city, but for the exiled too. Why? Because it offered perspective. For 10 years you'd be elsewhere. You'd live differently, perhaps think differently, and upon return, you'd share that new wisdom, enriching the city you once disturbed. Exile wasn't just about removing problems, it was about nurturing wisdom too. So perhaps the Athenians saw exile less as a punishment and more as an education, a 10-year lesson in humility, wisdom, and perspective. And when you returned, perhaps you'd blend better, speak more softly, move more deliberately, respect the invisible lines and quiet rules that kept Athens running smoothly. That was exile's hidden promise. You'd leave as disruption, return as wisdom. So as you head toward the horizon, your footsteps muffled by soft dust, keep this in mind. Athenians didn't hate you. They didn't even blame you. They merely chose peace over confusion, quiet over noise, harmony over chaos. And in 10 short years you'd quietly return, softly wiser, a welcomed stranger returning home. Until then, keep walking. The road is peaceful, the future uncertain, but you are not disgraced. You're simply on a long walk toward understanding. Now, let's continue your sleepy survival in ancient Greece, assuming, of course, you still have the strength for it. How would you survive exile? So, here you are. You've been quietly voted out, gently escorted to the city gates, and sent softly on your way. And now you stand on a dusty path, the gentle warmth of morning sunlight settling softly onto your shoulders as you ponder one very important question. How exactly do you survive exile? It seems straightforward enough. You walk away, you find somewhere else. You quietly wait out your time. 10 years, but survival, especially sleepy survival, isn't always so simple. Because as soon as Athens fades gently from your view, your problems change. Now, it's no longer about navigating subtle social rules, avoiding ritual missteps, or sidestepping curious glances. Now, it's about surviving the quiet. It's about surviving the space between cities, the spaces no one really claims, where you must reinvent yourself softly. But first things first, where exactly do you go? Exile in ancient Greece wasn't punishment in the modern sense. You weren't imprisoned, you weren't chained, you were simply unwelcome in Athens. That left plenty of possibilities. Perhaps you head toward a neighboring city-state. Maybe you'll softly find your way to Corinth, Thebes, or Megara, cities familiar yet foreign, comfortable enough to welcome a quiet outsider. You won't be a citizen there, but you'd at least be tolerated. You could rent a room above a market stall, softly make a living mending sandals, selling olives, or quietly copying poetry. But perhaps you prefer solitude. Many exiles sought isolated farmhouses, remote hillsides, small seaside cottages with soft ocean breezes, gently tucked away from city politics. There, you'd quietly tend vines, olives, or figs, living a life governed by seasons rather than social rules. You'd wake gently at dawn, work steadily through the day, and sleep deeply at night. In this life, you'd find your own sleepy rhythms, slowly forgetting why you were banished in the first place. Here, far from Athenian scrutiny, you might even come to appreciate exile as a quiet gift, a gentle escape from constant judgment. Yet solitude has its challenges too. Who would you speak to? What quiet conversations would fill your days? You could speak softly to goats, trees, or the gentle waves along the shore. You could keep journals, quietly scratching your thoughts into wax tablets, composing poems that no one would ever read. But humans are social creatures. Isolation might become its own gentle trial, a silent endurance test for your mind and spirit. And so, maybe you find a community, a quiet village far enough from Athens to ignore your ostracism, yet close enough to feel comforting. Here, villagers won't know your story. To them, you're simply another traveler, another face at the quiet market stalls, another soft voice at communal meals. You learn to blend, not by obeying strict rules, but by softly adapting. You learn the gentle art of conversation, asking quietly about crops, weather, and harvests. You learn local customs without scrutiny or pressure, because after all, you're already exiled. You can quietly embrace new rules or reject them without fear. In exile, the rules are different, softer, quieter. You can breathe gently without constant worry of making mistakes. And soon, perhaps you forget the very reason you were expelled. Perhaps in this quiet new life, Athens becomes a soft, distant memory, an old dream you once had. But exile isn't always gentle. Let's say you're unlucky. Let's say other city-states know your story, heard whispers of your ostracism, and quietly refuse you entry. You might find yourself softly wandering, city gates closed to you, sleeping quietly beneath olive trees, relying softly on the kindness of strangers. Would you survive that? Well, yes, probably. Because even exile had its own gentle rules. Strangers would quietly feed you, farmers might offer quiet shelter, fishermen could give you passage to a small island or coastal settlement. Ancient Greece valued hospitality, xenia, deeply. Even as an exile, you'd likely be welcomed softly into someone's home, fed quietly, treated kindly, and gently sent on your way. Exile wasn't cruelty, it was simply absence. You'd survive because others understood your quiet plight. They knew exile wasn't always deserved, wasn't always personal, it was just a quiet necessity. And so, survival meant adapting gently, softly accepting that Athens was temporarily beyond your reach. You might quietly begin to embrace exile, gently realizing that it gave you freedoms you never knew existed. You could speak your mind softly without fear. You could quietly challenge customs, question rules, innovate softly in your daily routines without fear of ostracism, because you were already ostracized. What more could they do? And this gentle freedom was perhaps exile's greatest gift. For 10 quiet years, you'd live differently, softly adapting, learning new ways of thinking, gently considering new perspectives. You'd survive exile, not by resisting it, but by quietly embracing it. This gentle journey could change you deeply. After years spent quietly away from Athens, you might return softer, wiser, less judgmental, and more accepting of quiet differences. Your eyes might softly perceive details you never noticed before. You might become a gentle observer, quietly reflecting on society's rules instead of blindly following them. Survival, you'd realize, isn't just about food and shelter, it's about mindset. Exile gently teaches you patience, humility, and quiet self-reflection. And when the 10 years ended, when the gentle sunrise marked your quiet return, you might find Athens welcoming you softly back. Not because you had changed dramatically, but because you quietly understood harmony now. Harmony, it turns out, was about gentle balance, quiet acceptance, soft coexistence. You'd blend back into Athenian society softly, subtly. People would see you differently, not as a disruption, but as someone who quietly endured, softly adapted, and gently survived. And perhaps that's exile's quiet secret. It wasn't punishment, it wasn't cruelty, it was gentle guidance, quietly pushing you toward deeper wisdom and self-understanding. So, how would you survive exile? Simply put, softly, gently, and thoughtfully. You'd quietly learn, adapt, and evolve, becoming a softly wiser version of yourself, gently shaped by years of quiet reflection. And perhaps after all, that's the real sleepy survival skill in ancient Greece, softly enduring, gently adapting, quietly embracing the unknown, and coming back softly stronger. Now, with Exile softly explained, let's continue your sleepy survival, assuming of course, you're still awake enough to hear it. Would you ever truly belong in Athens? You've survived breakfast, barely. You've navigated subtle morning rituals, faced silent judgment, endured gentle exile, and quietly pondered your return. But now, a deeper question emerges, quietly nudging your mind as you gaze softly across the distant hills toward Athens. Would you ever truly belong? Belonging, as it turns out, is a quiet but powerful word. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, belonging was everything. Belonging wasn't just citizenship. It wasn't simply about rights or privileges. It was about quietly knowing your place, gently accepting your role, and softly blending into the delicate social fabric that made Athens unique. And now you wonder, after all your gentle missteps, subtle misunderstandings, and quiet disruptions, could you ever truly be part of that fabric? It's a complicated question, with no simple answer. To Athenians, belonging was rooted deeply in subtle customs and gentle traditions. Your place was defined quietly by birth, softly by education, gently by profession, and most importantly, by your quiet acceptance of these unspoken boundaries. To belong was to quietly surrender individuality to community. It was a gentle exchange of personal freedom for collective harmony, yet here you are, a quiet outsider, a subtle disruptor, someone whose gentle presence through no fault of your own has caused quiet unease. Could someone like you ever fully embrace the quiet, disciplined life Athens required? Let's imagine your return after 10 years of quiet exile. You walk softly through the city gates at dawn. Athens welcomes you back gently, without fanfare or harsh words. You quietly settle into your former life, blending softly into the morning market, the gentle discussions at the agora, the quiet daily rituals. You've learned, through your quiet exile, how to softly conform, how to gently navigate subtle rules. But there's a quiet problem: you've changed. Exile, however gentle, leaves a subtle mark. You see the world differently. You quietly notice what others do not. Perhaps now, as you walk softly among your fellow Athenians, you begin to question quietly, privately, almost unconsciously. Not aloud, never aloud. You've learned that gentle silence is your best defense, but inside, a quiet voice persists. Do these subtle rules make sense? Is harmony always worth quiet sacrifice? Are traditions softly suffocating, or gently reassuring? These quiet thoughts mark you again, as subtly different. Not dangerous perhaps, but never fully belonging either. Belonging in Athens meant quiet acceptance. It meant gently ignoring these questions, softly suppressing doubt, quietly embracing conformity. You might wonder softly to yourself if true belonging is even desirable. Perhaps gentle independence, quietly cultivated during exile, is more valuable. Perhaps softly challenging the quiet status quo, if only in your private thoughts, holds more gentle satisfaction than quiet conformity. After all, Athens itself wasn't quietly uniform. Philosophers whispered softly in shaded porticos, artists gently painted scenes that subtly challenged traditions, poets quietly composed verses that questioned quietly beneath layers of metaphor. Athens tolerated gentle differences, as long as they were subtle, soft, quiet. Perhaps belonging isn't about abandoning your quiet questions. Perhaps it's about softly holding them, quietly nurturing them, gently letting them guide your subtle interactions. Belonging, after all, might be more nuanced than you realized. The city gently tolerated Socrates, at least for a while. Plato's quiet academy was permitted to softly flourish. Even gentle Aristotle, quietly challenging established truths, found a subtle place within Athens. Athens was at heart quietly flexible, as long as change happened gently, subtly, quietly. Maybe belonging, therefore, isn't absolute. Perhaps you quietly belong by softly existing between two worlds, by gently accepting tradition outwardly, while quietly questioning it inwardly. Your gentle exile, softly experienced, has quietly taught you balance. You've learned gentle patience, quiet observation, and subtle wisdom. Now perhaps you bring those quiet qualities softly back to Athens. You walk softly through marketplaces, quietly converse in shaded porticos, gently participate in rituals. You outwardly blend, softly conforming, quietly respectful. But inwardly, softly subtly, you quietly consider, gently question, quietly reflect. And perhaps this quiet duality is the truest form of belonging, one gently balancing tradition and change, quiet conformity and gentle independence. So would you ever truly belong in Athens? Yes, quietly, gently, subtly. Your belonging wouldn't be loud or obvious. It wouldn't be perfect. It would be quiet, gentle, imperfect, but real. It would be softly layered, quietly nuanced, gently complex. And perhaps that quiet complexity is the most authentic form of belonging there is. So, as you stand softly at the edge of Athens once again, ready to quietly reintegrate, remember this gentle truth. You do belong softly, you belong gently, you belong quietly. And sometimes, gentle belonging quietly matters most of all. Now, let's quietly continue your sleepy survival, assuming you're still gently listening. What if you refused exile? You've quietly accepted exile. You've softly reflected on belonging. You've gently considered your peaceful return. But now, a quiet question drifts gently into your mind. What if you simply refused exile? What if you decided, softly but firmly, that exile wasn't for you, that Athens couldn't quietly remove you with just pottery shards and quiet votes? Could you gently resist the gentle yet firm push out of the city? The quiet answer, of course, is that you could try. But would it quietly work? Let's softly explore this. In Athens, the gentle system of exile, ostracism, was uniquely civil, quietly respectful. There were no chains, no loud confrontations, no public punishments. Exile relied gently on the quiet compliance of the individual being exiled. It depended softly on your cooperation, but imagine softly that you don't cooperate. You quietly refuse to pack your belongings. You gently decline to leave your home. You softly and calmly tell your neighbors that Athens is your city too, and you have as much right to quietly remain as anyone else. Would the Athenians, gentle and calm as they were, quietly accept your refusal? Not exactly. You see, the gentle civility of ostracism was balanced by a quiet seriousness. Athens might exile gently, but exile was not optional. It was mandatory. Refusal was quiet defiance, something Athenians could not softly tolerate. What would happen next would be quiet but firm. At first you'd likely experience subtle pressure. Friends and family might gently urge you to reconsider. Quiet conversations would happen behind closed doors. Neighbors, softly embarrassed by your defiance, might distance themselves quietly, subtly, without fuss. But what if you gently persisted? Then Athens would shift quietly from subtle persuasion to gentle coercion. Officials would softly appear at your doorstep, not to threaten, exactly, but to quietly remind you of your civic duty. They would gently, respectfully, explain the city's expectations, softly reminding you of the consequences of quiet defiance. And still imagine you gently refuse. Imagine you remain quietly defiant, softly standing firm. At this point, Athens would have no choice but to respond firmly, albeit still gently by their standards. You would face quiet isolation, not harsh imprisonment, but gentle social exclusion. Your presence at public gatherings would be softly ignored. Vendors at the agora would quietly refuse to serve you. Neighbors would softly avoid your gaze, subtly closing doors as you pass. Your quiet defiance would softly transform you from a citizen into a living ghost, physically present, yet socially invisible. Could you endure this gentle, subtle punishment? Could you softly persist in defiance, knowing the entire city had quietly turned its back? Maybe, but gently, quietly, you'd begin to realize something deeper. The true power of ostracism wasn't physical exile, it was quiet social removal. By refusing exile, you've chosen something far more isolating, quiet, subtle social death. You'd live softly, quietly, alone in a city full of people, unable to gently connect, unable to quietly interact. You'd move softly among familiar streets, yet you'd be quietly invisible, softly untouchable. So you could refuse exile, but in doing so you'd softly trade gentle solitude for quiet isolation. You might soon find yourself quietly yearning for exile. You might softly dream of quiet hills, distant shores, gentle anonymity. You might begin quietly to understand that exile wasn't punishment, it was mercy, a soft escape from the quiet cruelty of social invisibility. Athenians understood this quietly powerful truth. Ostracism was gentle only because citizens respected it quietly. Defiance, softly expressed or loudly declared, gently eroded the delicate fabric of harmony the city valued above all else. And harmony, gently disrupted, couldn't softly tolerate defiance. Eventually, the city would act, not violently, but quietly and firmly. You'd be gently escorted, perhaps more firmly than before, to the city gates. Officials would softly ensure your departure. You might receive quiet support, food, clothing, perhaps coin, but the city's gentle patience would have quietly ended. Your exile, now less gentle, would begin softly but decisively. And as you walked that quiet road once more, you gently realize something profound. You hadn't been exiled from Athens. You'd quietly exiled yourself. Defiance, gentle or not, always had quiet consequences. Athenians valued harmony too gently, too deeply, to quietly tolerate disruption. Ostracism was quiet because it worked. It was gentle because it was respected. Your refusal would quietly remind you of this gentle yet powerful truth. Harmony in Athens was gentle but firm, quiet but immovable, subtle but essential. Your gentle defiance wouldn't quietly change Athens, it would softly change you. You'd quietly understand, gently, the powerful truth behind quiet exile. Harmony, gently maintained, was more important than quiet individuality. So could you refuse exile? Certainly. Would it quietly succeed? Not likely. Athens gently yet firmly insisted on harmony, and that gentle insistence was quietly stronger than any defiance, however softly expressed. Now let's quietly continue your sleepy survival, assuming of course that you're still softly listening. Could exile actually improve your life? It seems like the end. The word exile conjures visions of loneliness, hardship, and defeat. Yet, in ancient Athens, being banished wasn't always the tragedy it first appeared to be. In fact, for some, exile was the beginning of something entirely unexpected. Freedom. Consider this. The moment your name was counted among the Ostraca, your obligations to the city vanished. No more taxes, no more military duties, no more required debates at the Pnyx. You were, for the first time in your life, free from Athens itself. Exile meant you could go anywhere. Corinth, Thebes, distant Syracuse. You could cross the sea to foreign lands, where your name meant nothing and your past could be hidden as easily as a folded cloak. For some, this wasn't punishment, it was opportunity. Trade routes beckoned, merchant ships needed clever minds, distant temples needed skilled hands. Freed from the rigid structures of Athenian citizenship, exiles could reinvent themselves as traders, mercenaries, teachers, or philosophers. They could build fortunes that Athens would never have allowed them. Imagine waking each morning not to city bells demanding your voice in the assembly, but to quiet foreign markets where you decided your worth. Exile stripped you of identity, yes, but in doing so, it also removed expectations. And for some, that was a rare and precious gift. Even culturally, the Athenian mind viewed exile with curious duality. It was shameful, but also powerful. Poets and playwrights often hinted that those who left Athens could return wiser, wealthier, or somehow transformed. In distant lands, an Athenian exile might speak proudly of their home city. After all, distance softened memory, and in the eyes of foreigners, your status as a former citizen of Athens gave you a mysterious prestige. You became the traveler, the wanderer, the bearer of distant knowledge. Of course, this path wasn't guaranteed. Many exiles struggled, hunger and danger waited beyond the city walls. But for those with courage, cleverness, or a little luck, exile was not an end. It was a second life. And what of return? After 10 years, most exiles were permitted to come home. They carried stories, coins from foreign markets, scars perhaps, new ideas, certainly. Their past exile, once a mark of fear, often faded into quiet respect, for while Athens might vote to forget you, it never forgot entirely. And upon return, many found that the city welcomed their skills sharpened by the very exile meant to weaken them. So could exile improve your life? For some, it was the best thing that ever happened, because sometimes being forced to leave the city was the only way to discover who you really were. But let's consider the journey in detail. Once banished, the choice was yours. Would you head north towards Thebes, risking the mountain passes, or sail south towards Crete? Each direction offered uncertainty. Along the road, you might trade skills as a laborer, mend ships at foreign docks, or even sell knowledge of Athens itself to curious kings. The further you traveled, the lighter your exile felt. You could join mercenaries defending foreign cities. Athenian training was prized. Your once familiar spear could now feed you. Or perhaps you turned to teaching. Knowledge of rhetoric, mathematics, and philosophy held value across the Mediterranean. Even your simple ability to write could earn you bread in distant lands where literacy was rare. And yet, the loneliness remained. On quiet nights, you might remember the festivals of Athens, the smell of olive oil in the agora, the rhythmic debates at the Pnyx. These memories would haunt and guide you, shaping the person you became. As years passed, exile could redefine your identity. You were no longer simply an Athenian citizen. You were a survivor, a trader, a thinker, perhaps even a leader in some foreign town. Every sunset was a step further from the person you once were and closer to who you might become. In time, news from Athens might reach you, rumors of new wars, new laws, and perhaps whispers that your exile term was over. Would you return? Some chose not to. The freedom of foreign lands outweighed the familiarity of home. Others returned, walking those familiar streets not as outcasts, but as seasoned wanderers with stories to tell. Your return could be quiet or celebrated. Neighbors who once feared your influence might now value your foreign knowledge. Children who once watched you in the agora might now listen to your tales of distant temples and golden markets. Athens, after all, respected the well-traveled. So, could exile actually improve your life? Not for everyone, but for many, exile was not a punishment. It was a transformation. What would Athens think when you returned? Imagine it. After 10 long years, perhaps more, you stand once again at the edge of Athens. The city you once called home stretches before you, its stone walls pale in the morning light, the smell of dust and olives drifting on the breeze. And yet you hesitate, because what waits for you inside? For many exiles, returning was not triumphant, it was uncertain. The city that had once banished you now regarded you with quiet curiosity. Some might glance at you, recognizing the face but forgetting the name. Others might remember, but choose silence. In Athens, memories could fade as quickly as they formed. The system of ostracism wasn't designed for public shaming or permanent exile. It was built to prevent perceived threats, not punish them forever. And so, after your decade in distant lands, the rules allowed you to come back. No rituals greeted you, no fanfare welcomed you, no council awaited your explanations. You were simply home again. But what did home now mean? Neighbors would watch you from shaded doorways. Old rivals might pretend you never left. Family members, if they remained, would greet you awkwardly, unsure whether to treat you as returning kin or living memory. And yet, slowly, life resumed. Athens, as a city, was practical. If you had skills, they would be used. If you carried knowledge, it would be traded. Whether you had spent your exile as a merchant, a soldier, or a thinker, your experiences abroad could be valuable. The city that once feared your influence might now quietly desire it. For some exiles, return meant reinvention. Freed from old reputations, you could forge new roles, advising magistrates, training younger citizens, or opening a small shop where your foreign goods drew curious eyes. In time, your exile might become little more than a quiet rumor. But there were shadows. Not everyone welcomed returnees. Some Athenians mistrusted those who had lived beyond the walls. They saw danger in foreign ideas, foreign wealth, and foreign loyalties. Your presence could stir old fears, reminding the city why it once sent you away. Thus, returning was a delicate act. Walk humbly, and you might blend back into the city's rhythm. Walk too proudly, and suspicion might whisper your name once again. Philosophers debated whether an exile could ever truly belong again. Was the soul of the city a place one could re-enter, or was it a current you could never step into twice? For you, the answer might remain unclear. But as the days passed, your footsteps slowly wore familiar paths once more to the market, the public baths, the quiet shade of the olive groves. Perhaps you would find yourself seated at the edges of conversations you once dominated, listening instead of speaking, learning rather than leading. This quiet reintegration allowed you to move among the people as one of them, not above them. In time, you might reclaim your place in the assembly, your right to speak. Your words would carry a different weight now. Some would listen, not because they remembered your name, but because they respected your journey. And as your story spread, whether whispered or sung, people might ask where you had traveled, what you had seen, what foreign customs you brought back. Your knowledge, once feared, could now be admired. But memory in Athens was fickle. Children who had never known you before, exile might simply accept you as a curious elder with distant tales. Your rivals, aging themselves, might no longer care to fight old battles. Life, in its slow and steady rhythm, folded you back into its pattern, and so, after years of absence, you found that the greatest gift Athens offered was not forgiveness. It was indifference. Your exile was neither condemned nor celebrated. It was merely part of your story. In the silent courtyards, as you watched the sun set over the Acropolis once again, you might realize that home wasn't a place that remembered you. It was a place that allowed you to return, and that in itself was a kind of belonging. In that quiet moment, you'd realize something simple. Athens had not remembered you, but it had accepted you. And sometimes, that was enough. But the story doesn't end there. Consider the political atmosphere. Upon your return, Athens itself might have changed. New leaders now held sway in the assembly. Laws had shifted, alliances had fractured or formed. The city you left was not the city you returned to. Thus, adapting became not just a choice, but a necessity. You might find yourself allying with unfamiliar factions, supporting policies you once opposed, or trading goods from lands that were once your refuge. Life as a returnee demanded flexibility. In the religious sphere, temples you once frequented might stand the same, but the priests knew you not. Sacrifices offered for your safe return might be met with puzzled stares. Yet faith itself, that quiet personal thread, would help you anchor yourself. In the agora, your name might surface in new ways. Perhaps as the merchant who sells rare spices from Crete, or the sailor who knows the tides beyond Rhodes. Stories of your exile became currency of their own, traded for interest, respect, or simple curiosity. Over time, returning exiles often became bridges between Athens and the wider world. Your experiences allowed you to interpret foreign customs, languages, and politics. You became, in essence, both citizen and outsider, a valuable perspective in a city navigating constant change, and perhaps after many years your children or students would know your full story. They would hear of the vote that sent you away, the lands you crossed, the lessons you learned, and the quiet return that taught you the true meaning of belonging. So, what would Athens think when you returned? It would not cheer, it would not condemn, it would simply let you come home. And in that silent permission, in that quiet acceptance, you would find the answer to a question you hadn't even known you were asking. What does it mean to belong? Perhaps exile taught you this. Belonging isn't being remembered, it's being allowed to stay. The quiet echo of exile. What banishment meant for your soul. And so, as the morning sun lifted itself above the dusty hills of Athens, your fate was sealed. A small shard of pottery with your name upon it. A few quiet votes among neighbors you barely knew, and silence. No judge would shout. No guards would seize you. No public humiliation followed. Instead, exile in ancient Greece crept up like soft morning fog. The weight of the verdict lay not in spectacle, but in absence. You were simply expected to go. Within days, perhaps hours, you'd pack what you could carry. Maybe a change of linen, your father's old drinking cup, a few coins if fortune favored you. And then, you walked. But what did exile really mean in ancient Athens? It wasn't just physical distance. You were no longer part of the city's soul. In the ancient mind, the polis, the city itself, wasn't just stone walls and streets. It was identity. Citizenship wasn't paperwork. It was belonging. Rituals, festivals, votes, the voice you once held in the assembly. Silenced, your name, forgotten, even family ties could fray. Exile was a kind of social death. From your neighbor's perspective, you weren't hated. You weren't cursed. You were simply gone, like a statue removed from the temple. Still existing somewhere, but no longer part of the sacred pattern. For many exiles, life continued, somewhere else, in Corinth or Thebes. Maybe across the Aegean Sea, you'd find new streets to walk, new markets to trade in. But something followed you, a quiet sense that you no longer belonged anywhere. In dreams, perhaps, you'd still see Athens, the sun over the Acropolis, the crowded agora at dawn, faces half remembered. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'd wonder whose hand had written your name. Was it a neighbor, a rival, or simply a stranger who voted without thinking? That's the quiet cruelty of ostracism. No hatred, no accusations, just gentle forgetting. And you'd be banished before breakfast. Not for crime, not for chaos, but for the fragile, fleeting fear that you simply didn't fit. And in ancient Greece, that was enough. Sleep softly now, wanderer.